Okay, yes, I'm Wayne Smith, and I'll be talking about the history of the Unitarian Church, which was there where McDonald's used to be, and now it's over there up on Bridge Hill.
Dunkin' Donuts.
What did I say?
McDonald's.
McDonald's. So it has a D in it, it's about as close. And before we do anything, I want to introduce our minister, Reverend Sarah Heyman, who is sitting back there in the back. And if you have any theological questions, I'm referring them all to her. I'm into history, but I don't necessarily understand all the theological things. But even though I will be bringing up a little bit right towards the beginning. But, okay, I think we're ready to go. So, let's talk first a little bit about what's the difference between Unitarians and Trinitarians? This is the first question that has to be talked about. When I say the early years, I'm talking about the early years of what the next slide we'll call the Unitarian controversy or the Unitarian question. And basically, going back to 1620, New England Puritans, they eventually gradually developed two different ways of thinking about the relationship between Jesus and God. There was a Trinitarian view, which is the familiar God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. And then a Unitarian view, which basically is there is but one God. And that meant that the nature of Jesus is interpreted differently by the two different groups. So that sort of discussion was going on. And again, Sarah will answer.
He's doing a great job.
But anyway, that sort of a discussion was going on in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And that brought about this Unitarian controversy. This was ignited in 1805 when a liberal thinker was called to fill the chair of divinity at Harvard College. And of course, Harvard College has the famous Harvard Divinity School. And in general, over the last, since it began, it's tended to be more liberal in theology than conservative or orthodox. And when this particular person was, and I don't know who he was, I'll have to find out, but a liberal was chosen to fill the chair of divinity at Harvard College. And this gradually then heated up, and there was discussions, everything was going on. And in 1819, Reverend William Ellery Channing, who was a very famous Unitarian minister, published his famous sermon, Unitarian Christianity, which was actually started out as a sermon that he gave in Baltimore. And it became published in pamphlet form, and it sort of became the, quote, battle cry, not that we're fighting a war, but a battle cry of the Unitarians. So, as an example of one of the critical issues that this controversy brought up was what they call now the Dedham case, which was in 1820, Dedham, Massachusetts. As we all know, in early U.S. history, each town had a separate church building that functioned as the meeting house for the town, and it functioned as the established church. And everybody was taxed some amount of money to support the local parish church. In general, many of the townsfolk were liberals in thinking. Now, separate from that, there were also members of the church, say a Methodist church or a Baptist church or whatever church, and many of them were just simply called congregational in polity because it was just everybody that was there, they all got together and each congregation made its own decisions. Yet there were individuals who sort of had a more orthodox or conservative view of things. So the famous Dedham case, which is Dedham, Massachusetts, a judge decided, in the middle of a lawsuit, that whenever there was controversy between the two factions, the liberals versus the orthodox members of the church, and somebody threatened to walk out or something like that, then the liberals they had the rights to the church building and the other property of the church, and then the orthodox would have to go build their own building, and they would say things like, well, they kept the property, but we kept the faith. That was sort of the attitude that was going on. So with all that as background, let's look at an example. In Castine, which is not very far from here, in 1790, the town of Castine built its meeting place. And that meeting place is now what we call the Castine Unitarian Church. But, so at the time, there was only the one church. In 1798, a liberal by the name of Parson William Mason was called to serve that church. So in other words, for 8 years, it was the meeting place for the town, but they really didn't have a minister, per se. By 1820, the year of the famous Dedham case, the Trinitarians in that congregation decided, nope, this is not working out for us, and they walked out. And so they founded a separate church called the Trinitarian Church of Castine, which is still there. And the original church was then named the First Congregational Society, parenthesis, Unitarian. It's only recently, in the 1990s, I think, that it became renamed the Castine Unitarian Church. So all of this was going on in the background. And then in 1825, which is 6 years after William Ellery Channing gave his famous Unitarian Christianity sermon in Baltimore in 1819, 6 years later, the American Unitarian Association was formed. And that's the predecessor of what we now call the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. That was established in 1825 in Boston. It's still in Boston. And that was just 10 years before our first attempt to create a Unitarian presence here in Ellsworth. So, now how did it all start? Well, in 1812, the first pastor of any church in Ellsworth was Reverend Peter Noers, and he was the first pastor at the Congregational Church of Ellsworth, the one over by, well, right over here, behind, or by City Hall. I think I'm pointing in the wrong direction, right over there. Yeah. He wasn't
He's buried right behind it in the cemetery.
Yep. Oh, is he buried there? Anyway, he wasn't exactly a Unitarian, but he certainly had liberal views within the congregational polity. And he had, as a close classmate, he was a classmate of William Ellery Channing. And the Bible that he used in the church right over there was a Bible that had been given to him by Channing. So he certainly had Unitarian connections, even though he was ostensibly a congregational minister. He was there for, 23 years, and in 1835, there was some controversy here and there about belief systems, I guess, and of course the Unitarians wanted to keep with that type of preaching, and others wanted something different, so he decided to resign in 1835, and many of his parishioners said, we've got to start our own Unitarian society. So, on May 19th, 1835, if you were walking up and down the main streets of Ellsworth, you would have seen a little sign pasted up on the wall that said, public call for a meeting. Those persons in favor of forming a Unitarian society and taking measures for the support of liberal preaching in this town are requested to meet for that purpose at the Masonic Hall tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. That's all it said. And so people showed up. And at that meeting, on May 20th, 1835, Wednesday evening, David Dyer was chosen the chair, John Richards clerk. These are, anyone who's into Ellsworth history would recognize a lot of these names. David Dyer, among other things, was some connection, fairly close connection to John Black. And I think he was married to one of his nieces or something like that. I'd have to double check it. But he was also a carpenter. Anyway, that meeting was called to form ourselves into a society to be called the Unitarian Society of Ellsworth. And they sent out a committee. Unitarians are great for committees. They created a committee to procure a preacher and provide a place for holding public meetings. Well, that's good. So the very first preacher that they invited was a non-certified, what's the word? He was a lay minister, you could say, named Samuel Adams Devens. And he arrived in town on the last day of July and commenced the duties of a public preacher on Sunday, August 23rd of 1835. Okay. So, first permanent location, because we didn't have a church building at the time, they were going to use the townhouse, which I guess would be City Hall. Someplace in, I don't know where the townhouse was located in 1835. Does anyone know?
Probably Jones's house. He was up on Townhouse Hill.
Okay.
The YMCA.
Near the YMCA. That could have been. I'll have to do more research to find out exactly where it was. And they commenced Sabbath day services in the townhouse on September 6th of 1835. And then a couple of weeks later, a meeting of the Prudential Committee, which is that committee that was supposed to run everything, was held at Mr. Jarvis. Now that's Charles Jarvis, and that would be Colonel Black's son-in-law's father. No, son-in-law. Colonel Black's son-in-law, Charles Jarvis. He married, and we'll see this later, he married Colonel Black's daughter, Mary Ann.
Suyama house.
I'm sorry?
That's the Suyama house of
Yeah, we'll get there. Yep, that's right. We'll get there. And so they met on October 13th. They decided to invite Devens to be a preacher for $600 a year for the term of 9 months. So he came. He was what they called a public teacher beginning in August of 1835. He was there till April of 1836. Not a very long time, but there he was. And then very soon after that, he left the ministry and he started writing about his travels in Martha's Vineyard. He wrote this book, and here's another edition of it. And if you notice, you can't see it, I don't
Turn
think.
the light on.
Turn the light off?
Yeah, maybe they'll see better. We don't need it.
We'll try it and see what happens. Is that better?
No?
Okay.
Whatever.
It's not bad.
But if you are up here, you can look. It says, here it is. Okay, this book was written by an inexperienced clergyman. That's what he called it. That's how we refer to it. Should I turn that light back on?
Yeah, go ahead. I thought it'd help.
This is actually a plot to get me to get more exercise.
You need it.
So Devens left. Now, in the meantime, Mr. Wiswall, and his name was William Daniels Wiswall, he had been working. Remember that Reverend Mason, Pastor Mason, they called him Parson Mason, had been down at Castine, and he finished his work in 1835. So for those couple of years, other people were substituting, and one of them was William Daniels Wiswall, and so that's why they're referring to him as Mr. Wiswall of Castine, who at the time had not yet been, what's the word I'm looking for?
Ordained.
Ordained, that's the word I'm looking for. He had not yet been ordained, but he came up to preach for Mr., and that's how they spelled it, Devens, on Sundays, March 27th and April 3rd of 1836. After they had a chance to listen to Wiswall, they said, oh, well, this other guy, we think we'll just sort of not hire him again. And they got Wiswall instead. And so, to make a long story short, they said, okay, we're going to hire Wiswall. And he began formal preaching in May of 1836. And he was, I'm trying to think where it was, he was ordained very soon after that by the local congregation. So let me see where I was going. Okay, this is the Prudential Committee was busy having meetings and deciding things like that, and they said they decided to consult or confer with Reverend Wiswall about permanent settlement over the society. And then they had membership meetings. Lots of this stuff was going on. They love meetings. And so they decided, yep, we're going to call Wiswall. And so they wrote him a long letter, and we're not going to read the letter. But they said, would you like to come and settle with us? And he responded from Boston, and the middle part there, it says, I cheerfully accept of your request. So he said, yep, I'll be there. And so that's when he was ordained on July 5th, 1837. And he was ordained by the people. And that's still done in the Unitarian faith now. Ministers are ordained by their individual congregations. Okay? And then it didn't work out. So, Wiswall started in 1830, what did I say, 1837. And I'm going to read a little section of something here. Because it's interesting to find out what happened. We don't know exactly what reason was given for dropping Wiswall and then canceling the whole thing. But in his book, The American Heretic, Theodore Parker and Transcendentalism, Dean Grodzins, I don't know if anyone knows his name, describes how the well-known Unitarian theologian Theodore Parker had later hired Wiswall in January of 1846, so that's about, what, 9 years later, to fill the pulpit at his church in Boston. Grodzins described Wiswall as another little-known clergyman who had been without a settlement for years, and notes that for some reason he declined to deliver a sermon. Hello? And then Parker, in his sermon record book, angrily noted on that date, "No preaching, Wiswall was present." So apparently he wasn't the greatest preacher in the world. So, from 1839 to 1865, there was no Unitarian presence, except for individuals who still believed that way and whatever. However, in 1831, which means that in 1839, when the church folded, she was 8. But Anne Frances Jarvis Greeley, she was born then, and let's look at her ancestry. Her father was Charles Jarvis, whose father was Leonard Jarvis II, and they were big landowners and businessmen here in Hancock County. And then her mother was Mary Ann Black, the oldest daughter of John Black. Some people say his middle name was Nixon. I'm not sure about that. And her grandmother was Mary Ann Cobb. So it was quite interesting because John Black had no use for Charles Jarvis. Not at all. And there's a whole letter that I would love to read, but we don't have time for that. When Mary Ann Black writes a letter to her father saying, "Daddy, I know that you don't like him all that much, but I really love him, and I really hope that you'll..." Whatever. And so there's, Papa, John Black, and Jarvis Greeley's grandfather. He had become quite wealthy in his endeavors. There is his house. And that's Anne's parents, Charles Jarvis on the left and Mary Ann Black on the right. They had a total of 11 children. Large family. Yeah. And this is what she was commenting on. The Charles Jarvis homestead on the Surrey Road in Ellsworth was later owned by Virginia Suyama and her husband A.G. And it was where the Jarvis family had lived for quite a long time. I've been in that house for a meeting once. So anyway, Anne Jarvis eventually got married to Everard Howe Greeley on July 16, 1853 in Ellsworth. Everard himself was the son of Dr. Samuel Greeley and brother of Dr. Harvard Greeley. And Everard was very well known with his work with horses, breeding them, racing them, and betting on them. And this is where Everard and his brother grew up. And the house was over there where the Mex is located now. Okay, Anne was an incredible forward thinker. At the age of 20, in other words, about 1851, she purchased a store from a man named Thomas White, and she gradually built up a significant business selling high-quality women's millinery and fancy goods. And she used the second story, or the second floor of her store, to have meetings of a variety of natures. And she used to live then at the Suyama house. And then as she would walk into Ellsworth every day, this is what she would have seen. This was approximately the late 1800s. And her store was right where Camden National Bank is now. So we'll see that. Now this was taken from in front of her store, looking back. And Darlene, can you tell me what what this church is?
The Methodist Church.
That's the Methodist Church, okay, which is no longer there.
And the Catholic Church would have been over on the other side. Well, you can't see it, but it would have been up behind there.
Oh. On Chapel Street.
Keep up there,
Chapel
up
Street.
there.
Oh, up in that area?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Ellsworth was on the west side of the river, not the east side of the river. The churches, the jail, the courthouse.
A lot of what
everything
was-
on the
yes.
west side of the river.
Right. And then for a while there in the 1820s, it was going back and forth to Surrey. I know that some of that land was changing names quite a
Some
lot.
people whisper that some of it has never gone back.
I understand that where the library is technically part of Surrey. Whatever.
We won't tell them.
We won't tell anyone. So, now this is the Camden National Bank building, and the first house beside it at the time was Ann's store. This picture is from a little bit later. Well, obviously, if the Camden National Bank is there. But this picture goes back a little bit earlier. This was Ann's building here. And then there were two more stores to the left of it as you went down Main Street. Another way to look at that is this map from the time. Here on the left was Morrison and Joy's, and then the next one was the hardware store, and then Mrs. A.F. Greeley. That's where her store was located, and it was on the second floor of that store that she would call meetings of her friends, and interesting things would happen. This is what she sold at this place: dry and fancy goods, blah, blah, blah. And here's her business card. And another business card. That's both sides of the same card. She was a very, very prominent businesswoman at the time, and really one of the first I think the first businesswoman in Ellsworth. Okay, here's another map of Ellsworth from the time, and it was this third building right here, this little one, is her store, was her store. Those two buildings to the left of it were eventually taken down and replaced by the bank building. All right. Then the Civil War broke out. And during the Civil War, Anne was primarily focused on supporting soldiers from the state of Maine. And then unfortunately, at the very end of the war in early 1865, she lost both of her parents. So Charles Jarvis and Mary Ann Black were gone. So she was probably wondering, now what am I going to do? What devilishness can I get involved in? And she said, maybe we could reestablish a Unitarian presence in Ellsworth. Remember that her family was already involved in the first one. John Black and Charles Jarvis were both donors to the very first attempt in 1835 to create a church. So this is not a brand new idea that she cooked up one day. And she had two friends, so I'm sure she had many friends, Fanny Otis and Kate Dyer. Catherine S. Dyer, or Kate Dyer, who was a teacher in Ellsworth at the time. What the Unitarian thinkers were doing all this time, they were going to the Baptist meeting house, and they were hoping for any kind of Unitarian thought they might be able to pick up anywhere. It didn't quite work, and eventually they were sick and tired of it, and they said, okay, we've had enough of that. And so they decided to do something about it. So they wrote a letter to Reverend C.C. Everett of the Bangor Unitarian Church asking for help in finding someone that could help them organize a church in Ellsworth. And Reverend Everett contacted his friend Reverend William H. Savory of Groveland, Massachusetts, who then worked with them and helped found the society in 1865. Now, that was before the building was there. That's coming up next. Okay, he also worked here as the Hancock County Supervisor of Schools. Okay, he and his wife organized the society out of several heterogeneous elements. A few Unitarians, a few more Universalists, several from other churches who craved a more liberal theology, and a few of the unchurched. Sort of a ragtag group of interesting people. Which is, I think, how we can describe the church now. And so they decided, we've got to build a church, and so in the summer of 1866, they took the first steps towards building a church. They needed about $6,000 to build the church in the money of 1866. They assigned 3 people to be on the building committee, and then they bought the lot up at the street that we all are familiar with, the corner of Maine and Oak. They bought it for $1,250. And Reverend Savory went down to Boston or somehow got a plan that they could use to build the church from. And they hired I and O.W. Kent to build the church. And they got money from a variety of places. I don't know if maybe
someone knows, what the Independent Congregational Church of Bangor is. I wonder if that's an early name for the Unitarian Church of Bangor. I don't know, but they donated $1,000. The American Unitarian Association, they gave them an interest-free loan of $1,000, and other money came in from other people, including Sarah King of Taunton, Massachusetts, and George N. Black of Black House fame, from Boston. And they gave $100 towards the church. And it took a while, but it was completed in 1867, in the summer of 1867. That's the earliest picture I know of the church. It was an old tintype. And I just took this picture from the tintype. The church was dedicated on August 28th of 1867. We have the entire dedication ceremony. It was published in the Ellsworth American. They used to do that back then. And so every word that was uttered is in the Ellsworth American from that date. And here's another photograph that I just got recently from Darlene. This picture was taken sometime in the early 1870s. It's one of the prettiest pictures I've ever seen of it. Yeah.
It's from a stereo card, so if you looked at the card, it would appear to be three-dimensional.
Oh, wow. But it's a beautiful picture of the church. Of course, there were many ministers that served the church. Reverend William Lyon was the second minister after the establishment of the church. He was also ordained right there at the church in 1873. He was from Fall River, Massachusetts. He served for 5 years, and he was the minister during the building of the vestry, which is the next thing coming up. Here's an example of the Unitarian Church choir that was giving a public concert at 7:30 o'clock. That's what it said. 7:30 o'clock. That's how we greeted summertime. But that was the way that it was said. So, and this I think was it really interesting. Women had a major role in getting things done at the church. They were the activists. On September 2nd, 1875, the first meeting of the newly incorporated Unitarian Social and Benevolent Society, which began as the Women's Sewing Circle, was held in the room over Mrs. Greeley's store. That's where everything happened in Ellsworth.
That's right.
At the meeting, the women decided to raise the church building and build a vestry underneath it. And that's amazing. They said, let's do this. And then they started, collecting money to do it. And within 2 months, it was done. And the dedication service was November 10th. What day is today? November 14th. So we recently had an anniversary. November 10th of 1875. After the vestry was put underneath, this is what the church looked like. They raised, in other words, from this point here, all of that was lifted up. Underneath it, they put this vestry, and then they had to build stairwells. If you look back a few pictures ago, let's see if I can get to it.
Is it brick or stone?
It was wood. Oh, underneath, the very bottom, the vestry might have been stone. Who can tell me? I was not here to see that church. But anyway, notice that originally these doors were right here level with the ground. And now, looks like I can't go as fast as I thought. Now it's up, and so they had to build the stairs. Later on, I'm not sure exactly when, I have to look that up, they actually moved the stairs inside the building. So that I think most of you who remember the building remember going into the church and then up the stairs. But for a long time, you had to actually walk up the stairs outside the building.
Wayne?
Yes.
From a technical point of view of actually think about them lifting that building up and building that under it.
I know.
That was not the only one. They did the same exact thing to the Baptist church.
Really?
I have pictures of that down on the ground. It's amazing.
And there's so many stories of buildings being lifted up and moved to someplace else. The Surrey Historical Society building was moved from someplace else to where it is now.
Well, Harry Jones' house was the townhouse, and it was up where the YMCA is. And
Oh, really?
They moved it down on Main Street.
This building, Harry? I
Harry's
didn't know
house.
that.
It became a house, and then now it's a business.
Wow. Anyway, here's another map of Ellsworth, and you can see there's the church, and you see that the vestry had already been built. So in this drawing, they have the stairwells outside. I don't know if you can see it right there. Anyway, so the next minister was Reverend Charles Parker Lombard. 1878 to 1881. Then Lauren Benjamin McDonald, 1882 to 1884. We had lots of ministers. Robert Wellesley Savage, 1884 to 1887. Reverend Frank Healy, 1889. I don't know what happened to 1888. 1889 to 1890. Reverend Charles Canfield, 1891 to 1892. Lorenzo Darwin Cochrane. Now this was interesting because when he came, he brought his wife with him, and she was also an ordained minister in the Unitarian Church. And so she also, they were co-ministers. This was, I think, fairly unusual, but she was co-pastor with her church. And notice that I've written joint pastorate between Bar Harbor and Ellsworth. There was a Unitarian Church in Bar Harbor at the time, and on the first Sunday of the month, say, he would be in Ellsworth and she would be in Bar Harbor. And then the next month, the next week, they would switch parts. They probably could use the same sermon twice. Whatever. But, I mean, that's the way it would work. The Bar Harbor Church and the Ellsworth Church, they were going back and forth each week. Walter Hunt, 1896 to 1898. Arthur Corr, 1898 to 1902. Silas Sutton, 1902 to 1907. Now, this happened to be when the strongest earthquake that ever hit Maine happened in March of 1904. And the church building was significantly damaged. They had to spend quite a lot of money to fix the problems with the foundation and everything else. But they did. But at that point, I don't know what happened, but the church closed for about 5 years, 1908 through 1912. And mostly financial. They had just financial trouble. They just didn't have enough money to keep the church up. However, of course, the Women's Alliance, they kept going. The women are the backbone of this church. It's just true.
They are of every church, but not the women.
Anne turned 80. This is Anne Jarvis Greeley. She turned 80 on October 15th, 1911. And it was interesting. It was just sort of a snapshot of the time. Her husband was still very much involved with racing his horses and all that. And their daughter, Mary Ann, was now living with them. She never married. And she later became the first historian of the church. Sidney Scott Booth served at the church from 1913, 1914, after the church finally reopened. He also wrote entire scenarios for the fledgling motion picture industry. And this is early. So anyway, Reverend John Wesley Tickle, who eventually changed his name to John Wesley Hayes. I guess he got tired of being kidded about his name. He had originally been serving at the Methodist Church in Surrey. He was there for 5 years, and he was the last minister that Anne Greeley knew. She died October 22nd, 1914. And on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of her passing a couple of years ago, I had her tombstone cleaned. And because it was all covered with all that green stuff. So, and their daughter Mary Ann was buried with them when she died in 1951.
Where's that cemetery?
That's Woodbine.
Where is it?
If you go out
Main Street.
the upper part of Main Street, and she's in the back. I know how to get there, but I can't describe how to get there. Okay. Mary Ann was the first historian of the church. She wrote a very, very complete history in 1917, right after her mother died. And that still is the major text that I'm referring to for a lot of the early history of the church. It's a very, very well-written book. After that, George Tudor Jones served from 1920 to 1921. He was a cosmotheist, whatever that is. Charles Gustavus Gerelius, 1926 to 29, was very much liked. Everything I've ever read about him was very positive. George Riley was there from 29 to 36, that's a long time. He was involved with the Young People's Christian Union. You know, he played on a church basketball team, did all sorts of fun things. Harlan Evans was not considered an early, huh?
He used to live in Malibu.
Really?
I believe so. There was a
Eleanor.
I remember him.
You remember him?
Yeah,
Well, I didn't
go
know.
to church
My
there.
in-laws
The
lived.
Reverend Evans.
Really?
Yeah.
In what I read, it said that he was not considered an outstanding preacher, and he got in trouble in Bedford, Massachusetts for hunting quail out of season. He also was the only minister to graduate from the Massachusetts Military Academy. Okay. Herman Geertz served from 1942 to 44, and he left to become an Army chaplain. Of course, that was during the war. John Bryant, self-defined Christian liberal and anti-humanist. Okay, strongly independent. Okay, Ruel Beach served from 1946 to 1952. He used to provide services at the county jail. And he was a theist and a 32nd degree Mason. And I've been in touch with his granddaughter, who wrote to me for information about her grandfather that we might have in our records because she was writing a report about him in school. And I said, that's cool. Who was just talking to me about?
I was.
You were,
Yes.
yes. Emil Goodmanson married her and her husband. That was back in 1952, September 1st. Oh, he served from that date, September 1st, 1952.
Okay, I had it mixed up. I thought he had left and come back, but I had it mixed up.
Wow, so that looks like it was the very first day that he got here and you grabbed him right away. That's pretty cool.
Oh, no, wait a minute. No, I didn't get married till 56.
Ah, there we go.
I graduated from high school in 52.
Okay. Robert Noe. A lot of people remember Robert Noe, and I had a feeling that was going to happen. He was very much beloved by anyone who went to Ellsworth High School, the famous French teacher.
He was my reverse teacher.
He was,
The most honest teacher there was.
really?
I don't care what family you came from, you flunked the French test, you flunked the French test. He was very honest and he was a lot of fun.
And he was very much beloved.
Oh, yes.
He, and his wife just passed away relatively recently, about 10
Right.
years ago. So I knew Dot very well.
She was a teacher also.
Unfortunately, Bob Noe, he was trimming his tree, and there was an accident. He fell out of the tree, and that was unfortunate because he was. Everybody loved him.
No, not mine. The one in between.
All right,
That house is still there.
and then you have a story about him.
Yeah, I've got a picture, Sunday school picture. Sunday school picnic was at Maple Lord's place in Bayside, and he would play the guitar, and I'd been telling Wayne about it, because I said he would always play Jimmy Crack-Cohen and I Don't Care. Sing, and I couldn't remember the guy's name. And I was looking for pictures for Lloydfield the other day, and I found some pictures my grandmother had, and there is this picture, and there's me and my brother, and Terry and Phyllis Carlisle, and Thelma Beale, and Nancy Black, and the Strout kids, and they're all, he's playing the guitar, and they've seen the photographer, and they're all smiling, and I'm sitting right in front of him, and I'm just, I'm entranced, yeah, and we didn't know his name, and my grandmother had written on the back, Ted Smith.
Yeah.
So he was kind of excited to get a picture of Ted Smith.
He was also
with
very,
kids.
very beloved. He later served in other churches in northern Maine, and he died a little bit too early, but I've been in touch with people who remembered him well. So, Walter Smith. I was looking for information on Walter Smith. I was all over the internet trying to find it, and then I finally saw this. It said Walter Smith, and he was a minister, and I said, well, even if he isn't the right one, he might know of this other Walter, whatever. I wrote the guy an email, and I said,
I'm looking for a Walter F. Smith who used to serve as the minister of the Unitarian Church in Ellsworth, Maine. And he writes back, "You found me." He's now in his 80s. He's a hoot. He lives on Facebook. He loves it. He also has a fascination with trains. But he's been very helpful. He's been sending me messages here and there of, his recollections of people who used to be in the church back in 1958 to 60, way back then. So he's a heck of a nice guy. David Connors, he's the one that I can find the least information about. All I have is the information that's in the church records, and that's it, that he was from Bangor Theological Seminary. He served from 62 to 66. That's all I know about him. I still don't know any more. Does anyone know him? Well, I'm still going to look.
It was evasive.
Richard Gibbs, we all loved him. He served from 1968 to 1973, and he was instrumental in the transition from the old church to the new church on Bridge Hill. And he was specifically picked by the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, to help build up the Ellsworth Church. So what was the situation? And Mary or anyone else who might want to add to this story, feel free to do so. The church building was getting very, very old. The people who were going to the church were decreasing in numbers, and the church was starting to falter, and we wondered what's going to happen to this church that we love so much. And if you want to jump in at any time, I'm hoping you will.
You're doing fine.
People were very sad about the idea of wanting to, close the building down and moving to some other place that they weren't sure. It wasn't their home. It wasn't what they grew up with, and all this. But the decision had been made. It had to be taken down. It was falling apart.
Our last time at the Sunday school, there were only 2 of us left, I think, and I was a teenager, and they wouldn't let us go in the room because the floorboards were so bad, they were afraid we would fall through, and so it had fallen into the first floor and into the basement, so we weren't allowed to do it. It was really literally falling apart. There were rooms you couldn't go in, they were afraid you'd go right through.
Right. And there was a reporter from the Ellsworth American who was interviewing Reverend Gibbs on the streets in front of the church. And he was just saying that, this building is getting so old, it's falling apart, blah, blah, blah. And just as he said that, a piece of the shingle or something on the roof fell right behind him, almost hit him on the head. It very aptly demonstrated what the problem was. And so there was no question they had to take the building down. Everyone was sad, and Mary has shared a lot of interesting stories with me about how people loved that church and what it meant. I mean, it was right in the center of Ellsworth. It was where everything happened. Everybody had been in that church. Everybody knew that church. And it was really hard to make a decision to take it down. But, whatever. So there was the old church. Notice that at this point the stairway has been pushed inside the building. This is just before it was taken down.
See the white thing out front? You know how the Unitarian Church always has the little thing?
The wayside pulpit.
Well, yeah. Well, we didn't have any money, so that is on posts. It's a big thing, and who was it? Louis Smith.
Yeah.
He would tell me it would be up for like 3 weeks, but he'd tell me every 3 weeks what the saying was he wanted on it. And I figured out, I had stencils, and I figure it all out, and then I'd take a black magic marker, and I'd fill in, and my letters would be there for like 3 weeks behind glass, and then I'd do it the next 3 weeks.
Right. We still have that what's the word I'm looking for? That practice. Now, we still have, in front of the new church, we have this wayside pulpit. And who was telling me that was what they used to refer to the new church as, the wayside pulpit. That whole building was referred to as the wayside pulpit because it was on the side of the road, and whatever. That was an old name for the new church. But anyway, we still have that sign. It's in the shed out in the back. Anyway, these were some of the last pictures taken of the church before the deconstruction of it. Yeah, I love this pending thing.
Yes,
Mm.
huge.
This was inside the church. And Darlene, these are some of the pictures I've been telling you about that I don't think you've ever seen.
No, I have one of inside, Mary told me it was inside. but I
Yeah.
don't remember.
And so there's quite a few pictures here that I wanted to share of the church inside it. And Diane, is that the thing?
That's the velvet, red velvet curtain that hung behind the pulpit there.
Right. And you have a piece of that?
I
at
couldn't
Bird's
find
Acre?
it. I looked for it after you left today, and I couldn't find it. We had it. It was over at Bird's Acre. but,
Yeah.
Couldn't find it.
And there was, do you want to share your family's connection to the church?
I wasn't, well, I joined the church there when I was in the junior, sophomore in high school, I think it was. And actually, at one point, at that time, there weren't many of us in church, like when you were there, you were the last two. But that year, the Women's Alliance decided to send me to Star Island for the youth group week at Star Island, and I was the only one from the state of Maine that was there.
Where, Star Island is located where?
Off Portsmouth, New
Yeah.
Hampshire, and that was where we used to have the big young people's,
I know, Dartmouth is
It's
there.
still happening.
Yeah.
at Star Island, they still.
Yeah, UCC and UU.
Oh, really? Okay. That was a great experience. I was scared to death, but that was a great experience there. But I guess the history is that my parents were very active in
Extremely.
the
Her
Unitarian
father
Church.
was Chandler Richmond, who
And-
was, he's been the president of the congregation, and then your mom, Marion Gaspar Richmond. My grandmother was a Gaspar. Yay! So we're cousins. But she was one of the historians of the church, and I got a lot of information from her reports too, back in the 1970s.
And at one point, you had the Women's Alliance that was, as you said, running the church. And my mother was active, and they set up a junior women's alliance for the younger women. There was always,
The
I just
women's,
remember you had the church fairs.
Yes.
And,
the Women's Alliance was the backbone of the church,
Right.
and they were famous for making the May baskets.
yeah.
That would be sold up at Maine Coast Mall
Yeah.
and things like that. That had been going on since sometime in the 1800s.
My grandmother started that, and she would fill her house, and each room, you'd start with a little dining room. You remember choruses, and then there'd be living room, and then all the bedrooms upstairs, and by the time they first came, it was plaster. We've got pictures, like, hundreds and hundreds of May baskets. She could do anything, and everyone waited for the Unitarian Church May baskets. They were beautiful.
That was what we were associated with. And these are more pictures. This is apparently during the offering and singing of hymns. This is looking back here towards the choir loft. And there's that velvet piece of cloth that you were talking about. This was the organ. And I guess this was just a decorative, I don't know what that thing on the right
Just like
was.
a saying on the wall in the center section, God is love. That
I
was
see.
the only thing that was on
Do
there.
you know what kind of organ it was?
I don't know. Some people have told me that was moved over to that church, but that's not true.
No.
And I don't know what happened to that organ. I have been trying to find out for a long
Was it a
time.
pump organ?
I don't
Well, my
know.
grandfather pumped the organ in the church.
In that
When he-
church?
When he was a child.
That answers the question. I didn't know that.
Oh, that's my mother always told me.
What was your grandfather's name?
Harry C. Austin.
Harry C.
Yeah, the furniture store.
Yeah, the furniture store. Yeah, Harry C. Austin. Okay, and well, I have more people to talk to. Don't anybody leave until I know how to get in touch with you. There's a lot of research that I still have to do. But I'm the historian at the church now, and I just retired 5 months ago. This is what I'm doing now, and I love it. This was downstairs, I think, in the vestry, is that right?
Right, yeah.
And this would have been coffee hour after church.
And this, was that also on the same floor? I don't know where this building, or was that in another place?
That was downstairs.
That's when you first go downstairs, the piano's on the right, and this is where they'd have their fair, the church fair, in that building.
That would have been the room they built.
Are you talking about this picture on the right?
Yeah,
Okay,
pretty sure.
it looks like a dining hall. I didn't know if this might be part of the next thing. The next place that we're going to is going to be the Oddfellows Hall, and I didn't know if that might be part of that. This was the choir loft, and this was the minister, Reverend Gibbs, and some of the members at the time. And this is the last set of pictures that I have from the old church. Oh, sorry, I lied. This must be the kiddos' room.
That's where you'd walk in that door that you saw, and you could go straight up the stairs to church, or you turn left and you went down about 6 steps that were concrete into that room, and that was where the Sunday school was, and that's where the women had their church fair. And the piano on the right, that's the one that Ann Black played every single week, and the only song she knew was For the Beauty of the Earth.
Oh, that's great. That's great. This is a color picture. This is the organ, and then you said that says God is love?
Yes, that was in big letters, God is love. There may have been some filigree around it.
Yeah. But that's the only picture in color of these.
And
Then-
when you were saying the choir loft was upstairs,
Yeah.
in the end, that was never used. No one ever dared go up there. It wasn't safe. And so where you see the organ, that's where everyone stood.
Yeah,
for the
this
whole-
area over here, I think, is where, right in front of it is where the choir used to sit later.
That was the choir loft.
You see up front of in front of the church, in front of the pipes, that's where we sat when we were in the choir.
Yeah.
At least when I was, from the time I was little.
And then, of course, this in 1971, I think the last church service was something like June of 1971. So beginning the very next month, they started taking the church apart. And it's funny because pieces of this church have ended up in everybody's house. Every time I talk to someone, they say, "Oh yeah, well we have a piece of the church here, and we've got a little piece of that, and then we got some of the windows."
It's all over Ellsworth.
It's like it went everywhere. Everything was recycled, which I think is something we approve of.
It's cool, huh?
But and so then temporarily we used the Oddfellows Hall up here on North, what do they call it, North Main Street. Oops. Oh. And they had church services there, and then they even had all their, all the food and all that sort of stuff was downstairs there. And then the new church building. This is the day of the groundbreaking, which was in 1972. I think it was October of 1972. And then eventually the new building was finished, and that's where we are now. At the new location, we didn't have a regular called minister for a while. So throughout the 70s, we had guest ministers. One of them was Arthur Foote, who's, if anyone who might know France Damon's her dad. And then Reverend Harry Meserve was specifically called in 1974. He was very popular. I got to know him. He was a tremendous speaker. He was very soft-spoken. But boy, every word he said was fantastic. Tremendously highly regarded. And Charles Stevens is, by the way, let me go back one. Harry was chosen as our first minister emeritus. And then Charles Stevens has just recently been chosen as our second minister emeritus. He served throughout the 1980s. We had an interim minister from 1990 to 91, Ralph Clark. He's now working in Mendon, Uxbridge, Massachusetts. Mark Worth was the minister there when I joined in 1994. And he was there for 14 years, which was, I think it was about almost 15 years. And I loved him. I mean, that's why I ended up there. And he was our third minister emeritus. When he left, Reverend Stephen Finney came in for 2 years. And then we chose Leela Rajani Sinha as our next minister, who was there for 2 years. And now, this lovely lady in the back row. Sarah, is it A-N-N or A-N-N-E?
No, it's right.
Okay, I was worried about how to spell it. And she began in September of 2011. And that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.